Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to tackle a really tough condition in the equine world, and that's chronic equine dysautonomia.
ED for short.
ED for short. This is a condition that, it's really puzzling. It seems like a horse's nervous system just goes completely haywire.
It really is. It's a tough one, especially the chronic form where those symptoms linger for more than a week. But, we've got some fresh research here that might shed some light on what's happening at the cellular level.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What's this new piece of the puzzle all about?
Well, it centers around a substance called Lipofuscin. Sometimes it's called the age pigment.
Age pigment.
Yeah. Imagine it as cellular rust. That builds up over time.
Cellular rust.
Yeah, and it especially builds up in the lysosomes, which are basically like the cell's cleanup crew.
Okay, cellular rust, huh? I'm definitely intrigued already.
Right.
But how does this relate to ED in horses?
Well, that's what the researchers have been trying to figure out. They've been looking into whether Lipofuscin might be more than just a sign of aging, but, actually a contributor to the nerve damage that we see in chronic ED cases. They've been focusing specifically on a particular cluster of nerve cells in the horse's neck called the cranial cervical ganglia. Think of them as command centers for all sorts of really vital functions.
So they were looking at whether these command centers were getting bogged down with this cellular rust, with this Lipofuscin, in horses with chronic ED.
Exactly. And they use these really special staining techniques to actually visualize and measure the amount of Lipofuscin that was present in these neurons.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. So what did they discover?
Well, first, they confirmed that as horses get older, those Lipofuscin levels do naturally increase, just like we might expect.
Just like wrinkles for us.
Exactly. But, and here's the kicker, they found a much higher percentage of these Lipofuscin-filled neurons in horses with chronic ED compared to healthy horses, or even those with acute ED, which is the short-term form of the disease.
Oh, wow. So it's not just age, it's the duration of ED that seems to really ramp up that Lipofuscin buildup.
That's exactly right. And to make things even more interesting, they also found a really strong correlation between the number of affected neurons and the total amount of Lipofuscin that was present. Basically, the more of these Lipofuscin-packed neurons you have, the more Lipofuscin you have in total.
Okay, so I definitely see the connection now between chronic ED and increased Lipofuscin. But the big question is this buildup causing the nerve damage, or is it just a result of the damage that's already happening from the disease?
Yeah, that's a key question, and unfortunately it's one that this study can't definitively answer yet. It could be a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. More research is definitely needed to tease out that cause and effect relationship.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tricky to untangle. So how does this research change our understanding of ED?
Well, I think it opens up some really fascinating avenues for exploration. If Lipofuscin is actually more than just a byproduct, and it's really contributing to the nerve damage, that could have big implications for both diagnosis and treatment down the road.
You mean we might be able to use Lipofuscin levels as a marker for chronic ED? Or even develop therapies that target that cellular rust?
Exactly. It's still really early days, but this research gives us this whole new lens through which to view this complex disease.
Wow, I'm starting to really see the potential here.
Yeah.
I bet our listeners really itching to hear the specifics of the study, so I think let's dive into those details next. What do you say?
Let's do it. We'll unpack the study design, the techniques they used, and all of those really key findings that have us so intrigued. Welcome back to our deep dive into equine dysautonomia and that link to Lipofuscin.
Before we really dig into the study itself, I'm curious about why they chose to zero in on those cranial cervical ganglia. What makes those nerve cell clusters so important?
Well, they're consistently affected in ED cases. Remember how we talked about ED primarily impacting the autonomic nervous system?
Yeah.
These ganglia are a key part of that system.
Uh-huh.
They play a role in regulating all sorts of vital functions.
So by looking at the CCG, they're essentially getting like a window into how ED is affecting those crucial nerve cells.
Exactly. And they wanted to compare those Lipofuscin levels across the different forms of ED. Acute, subacute, and chronic, as well as in healthy horses of different ages. So what they did was they divided their horses into 5 groups of 8, making sure to include a good mix of breeds and sexes in each.
Okay, so a nice diverse group to work with.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through those groups?
Yeah, sure. So they had groups for acute ED, subacute ED, and chronic ED, along with 2 control groups, young, healthy horses and aged, healthy horses. So they could compare the Lipofuscin levels across those different stages of disease and aging.
Gotcha. Okay, so how do they actually go about measuring the lipofuscin. You mentioned special staining techniques earlier.
Right. They use a stain called Schmorl stain. Okay.
Which specifically highlights substances like lipofuscin under a microscope.
Okay.
They also did a preliminary trial with a few other stains, including PAS stain, just to double-check that what they were seeing was indeed lipofuscin.
Okay, so they were really meticulous about making sure they were looking at the right thing.
Yeah. They wanted to be sure.
Did they just, eyeball it under the microscope? Or did they get more precise than that?
No, they actually used some pretty sophisticated image analysis software to quantify the amount of lipofuscin present in each neuron.
Wow.
They could literally measure the cellular rust buildup.
Okay, so that's impressive. Okay, let's talk results. They were looking at the relationship between age and lipofuscin, right? What did they find there?
So, as expected, they found that the percentage of neurons containing lipofuscin increased as horses got older.
Yeah.
This was true across all the groups, regardless of whether they had ED or not.
So lipofuscin accumulation seems to be a natural part of aging in horses, just like wrinkles for us humans. Yeah, a good analogy. But here's the key. Finding the duration of ED also had a significant impact on those lipofuscin levels.
Okay.
The horses with chronic ED had a much higher percentage of those lipofuscin-positive neurons compared to the acute cases and the healthy horses, both young and old.
Interesting. So it's not just a matter of getting older, but having ED, especially that long-lasting chronic form, seems to really accelerate that lipofuscin buildup.
That's exactly what the data suggests. And to make things even more compelling, they also found a strong correlation between the number of neurons containing lipofuscin and the overall amount of lipofuscin present.
Okay.
Basically, the more of those lipofuscin-filled neurons you have, the more lipofuscin you have in total.
Okay, so there's a definite connection between chronic ED and increased lipofuscin. But again, we're back to that chicken or egg question. Is this buildup a cause of the nerve damage we see in ED, or just a consequence?
Right, that is a key question. And unfortunately, this study can't give us a definitive answer. It's possible that the lipofuscin itself is contributing to the problem, perhaps interfering with the neuron's ability to function properly.
So it could be this vicious cycle. The longer the ED persists, the more lipofuscin builds up, and that in turn could further damage those nerve cells.
Exactly. But we also can't rule out the possibility that the lipofuscin buildup is simply a byproduct of the damage that's already being done to those neurons by the disease process itself.
So it's like the lipofuscin is a marker of the damage rather than the cause.
Precisely.
Gotcha.
And we have to acknowledge that there are a few limitations to this study.
I was about to ask about that. What kind of limitations are we talking about?
Well, for one, the sample size was relatively small. Having more horses in each group would strengthen their findings.
Okay.
And they weren't able to use the most precise method for detecting and measuring lipofuscin, which is based on a phenomenon called autofluorescence.
Autofluorescence, that rings a bell. You mentioned that earlier, right?
Right. Lipofuscin has this cool property where it naturally emits light when hit with certain wavelengths. So using autofluorescence could give a much more accurate and reliable reading of those lipofuscin levels.
Interesting. So future studies could use this technique to get a clearer picture of what's going on.
Exactly. And there's so much more we can explore. Remember, this study focused specifically on the cranial cervical ganglia, but ED affects a wide range of nerves throughout the horse's body. It would be fascinating to see if those lipofuscin levels vary in other parts of the nervous system.
You mean like in those other nerve clusters involved in the autonomic nervous system?
Exactly, like the prevertebral and paravertebral ganglia.
Yeah.
And even within the enteric plexuses, which control the gut. Remember, gut dysfunction is a major hallmark of ED.
Right, so getting a more holistic view of those lipofuscin levels could give us a better understanding of how the disease is impacting the nervous system as a whole.
Precisely. And while this study focused on the connection between ED duration and lipofuscin levels, there could be other factors influencing that relationship as well. The severity of the disease, the horse's diet, environmental exposures, all of these things could play a role.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. The more we learn, the more questions we have.
Right.
I'm already wondering about those potential research avenues and what they might reveal.
Yeah.
Should we head in that direction next?
Absolutely. Let's explore what future research might hold and consider some of the broader implications of this study.
Welcome back, listeners. We're in the home stretch now of our deep dive into ED and that fascinating link to lipofuscin.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground so far.
We have.
From really defining what ED is to that intriguing study looking at lipofuscin levels. So now I think it's time to turn our attention to the future.
Okay.
What's next in this research journey?
That's what I'm really eager to hear about.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here? What are some of the most promising avenues for further investigation?
Well, for starters, I think we need larger, more comprehensive studies. Remember, this particular study had a relatively small sample size.
Right. 8 horses per group.
Exactly. Having more horses in each group would give us a lot more data and make those findings even stronger.
So more horses, more data. Makes sense. What else is on that research wish list?
Well, they also highlighted the need for more advanced techniques to detect and measure lipofuscin. Remember how we talked about autofluorescence?
Yes, that's the gold standard, right?
Precisely. Autofluorescence is basically where certain molecules emit light when they're excited by specific wavelengths, and lipofuscin happens to autofluoresce. So using this method would give us a much more precise, reliable measurement.
So future studies could incorporate autofluorescence to really nail down those lipofuscin measurements.
Exactly. And they could really expand their scope beyond just the cranial cervical ganglia.
Okay.
Remember, ED affects nerves throughout the horse's entire body.
Yeah.
It would be fascinating to see if those lipofuscin levels vary in other parts of the nervous system.
Okay, so it's like we need to map out the lipofuscin landscape in ED.
That's a great way to put it. We could look at other nerve clusters that are involved in the autonomic nervous system, like the prevertebral and paravertebral ganglia.
Okay.
And we can't forget about the enteric plexuses, those networks of nerves that control the gut.
Right.
Remember, gut dysfunction is a major hallmark of ED.
Right. So getting a more holistic view of those lipofuscin levels could really help us understand how ED is impacting the nervous system as a whole.
Absolutely. And, this study really focused on the connection between ED duration and lipofuscin levels, but there could be other factors that are influencing that relationship, too.
Like what?
Well, the severity of the disease, for one.
Okay.
Also, the horse's diet, environmental exposures. All of these things could potentially influence those lipofuscin levels.
It's like a giant puzzle with all these interconnected pieces, so many possibilities. This research is really opening up some fascinating new avenues to explore, but it also makes you wonder about the bigger picture, too.
Yeah.
We keep talking about lipofuscin in the context of ED, but is there a broader significance here?
That's a really insightful question, and the answer is yes. I think this study, along with other research on lipofuscin, raises some really intriguing questions about the connections between aging, neurodegeneration, and this mysterious disease. We've touched on this already, but I think it's really worth emphasizing.
It seems like this tiny little molecule is holding some big clues.
Yeah.
And not just for horses.
Right.
We know lipofuscin is a hallmark of aging in many species, including us, humans. And it's been linked to several neurodegenerative diseases in people.
Exactly. So by studying lipofuscin in horses with ED, we might actually gain some insights that could inform our understanding of those similar processes in humans.
Wow.
It's a reminder of how interconnected everything really is.
That's pretty amazing. So to wrap things up, what's the key takeaway for our listeners today? What should they be mulling over as they walk away from this deep dive?
I think the key message is this research adds a really valuable piece to the puzzle of equine dysautonomia. While there's still so much that we don't know, the connection between lipofuscin and the chronic form of this disease is definitely intriguing.
Oh.
It warrants further investigation, and it really has the potential to open doors to new diagnostic tools and treatment strategies.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. It's really made me think about ED in a whole new way. I'm definitely going to be keeping a close eye on this research, and I just can't wait to see what future discoveries emerge.
Me too. And remember, every new finding, every step forward, brings us closer to better understanding, better treatment, and ultimately prevention of this devastating disease.
Well said. And on that note, to all of our listeners out there from Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.